So thank you very much, especially for the invitation. It's great to be here and be able to present and to talk at this conference. I would like to say that I've worked at the ETH. I do work at the ETH. I also work at the University of Bern, and I have a lot of the original work that I did was started out at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, and so I also work closely with a lot of the people there. And my topic is, should we really only be concerned about carbon and biodiversity? And the reason that I raised this question is that if you look at a lot of the European Union policy emphasis these days, it's all about carbon and or biodiversity protection and so on. And the discussion really doesn't go too much further than that. And I think the emphasis on these things is important, but I think it's not enough. And so I will try to talk about that today. And I'll start out with a graph that looks very confusing because it's got all this stuff in it. And what this is kind of an exercise. You have all of these visions over here of different strategies for achieving ecosystem resilience, right? But in the long run, they're all very different, and they emphasize different features of ecosystems and have different objectives and build different strategies about how you might achieve ecosystem resilience. And I think all of them are mostly in some way deficient. So I wanted to sort of go through this a little bit. And the game is to try and fit these to different parts of the dimensions of this particular figure. So if we start out and we look at climate regulation through the UNFCCC, and of course there, the focus is really only on carbon. All of these other features, biodiversity, water, energy cycle, all of these things are completely missing from this framework, and they don't really get discussed in this framework, right? At least in terms of the ecosystem side of things. And then we have sort of the ecosystem resilience focus. For example, the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, or the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment from 2005, or all the emphasis on forest landscape restoration. Once again, it's primarily focused on carbon. Maybe it includes a discussion on water, not adequately most of the time, certainly not in my view, and also it doesn't necessarily always adequately deal with species diversity. And then of course we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, or Biodiversity, and here the emphasis is really primarily on species diversity, but not a lot of attention to things like carbon, trees, forests, and so on, much less anyway. And of course, there's not really much of an emphasis on water. And we can take this one step further. We have this IP-BES discussion, which is now really a big thing these days. But of course, here, the emphasis is primarily on ecosystem provisioning, the ability of nature to provide contributions to people. And once again, it neglects the water side. It does sort of include the biodiversity side. That's why I put IP-BES at both ends of this dimension, right? And we can go further. There's a lot of emphasis in forestry these days on integrated forest management, which seems to try and align ecosystem resilience with biodiversity protection, but ignores a lot, to a great degree, the climate regulation perspective and the ecosystem provisioning perspective. We could look at climate smart forestry, which seems to focus a lot more on the climate perspective and ecosystem provisioning, but tends to ignore more biodiversity or ecosystem resilience. And I'm not going to add all of these things in, but I will add one more. What about energy? And of course, my paper, which I will talk about today, tries to integrate energy into this framework as well, all right? But if you look at all of these frameworks, there's always something missing. So, next slide. What are the key state variables for defining ecosystem resilience? Well, it's certainly not just carbon, and I would add here that we need to think about water. So in this paper in 2017, this is what we did to focus on forest and water interactions. And this is what I will. And also, this one doesn't really do water adequately, so I think water is incredibly important to emphasize and to think about. So I've published a lot on this topic. This last paper is not mine, but cites my work as the foundation, basically, for these forest-water interactions. And I'd like to go through this very quickly and very simply. Now, if you ask yourself, where does the contribution to rainfall come from? Most people will focus on the contribution from oceans, which is about 40,000 cubic kilometers of water at the global scale. But of course, over land, we have 113,000 cubic kilometers of rainfall. So how do we get that? Where does it come from? If it's not coming from the oceans, where does that water come from? Well, most of it comes from evapotranspiration and evaporation from the land surface, which is predominantly the result of tree, forest, and vegetation cover. So as soon as you understand that, then you have to ask yourself, what happens if we take all that tree, forest, and vegetation cover away? Disappears. What does that mean for rainfall? Does that mean that we would only have 40,000 cubic kilometers of rainfall on the land? What might that mean for agricultural production or heat on the land surface? And the next thing is, once you've thought about that, then you also have to ask yourself the question, what if we were to restore all of the historically lost vegetation on the land surface? So theoretically, we've lost anywhere between 30, 40, 50% of the historical land forest cover that was there before. So if we put it all back, what that might mean for rainfall on the land surface, right? Would it mean this much, 186,000 cubic kilometers of water? What might that mean for agricultural production? Could we produce more? Or might it mean we'd have to produce less because now we have less land available for agriculture? Might that mean for cooling power on the land surface? Now, the basic point about all of this is that precipitation recycling, which is what I call this, precipitation comes in, falls down, it gets evapotranspired, goes back up, turns into clouds, turns into rainfall again, and contributes to this hydrologic cycle over land. And it also helps transport water across land, across continents. Now, I would argue there are, and have argued for a long time, there are large and important benefits from increasing wetland and forest cover across the land surface, and that the total water available for rainfall on the land surface is a variable, right? It's something we can influence. It depends on the types of land use practices that we have on the land surface. And it depends heavily on the density and extent of tree and forest cover overall. More tree and forest cover can positively affect the relative intensity of the hydrologic cycle over land. Simple. Okay. So what does that mean for restoration goals? Well, we can incorporate this into restoration strategies. Most people, when they think about restoration strategies for forest, just say we should plant more forest. But presumably we should be much more strategic about this. And the reason is we want to focus on areas that have a lot of water and be able to transport that water to other locations. So upwind coasts should be heavily forested, regardless of where they are, even on islands, right? Or in the Alps, for example. And we should then share that water around, right? We should cycle it and provide it to other locations across the continent. So that's good enough. But to come back to this image once again, what are the key variables, state variables for defining ecosystem resilience? What are the key variables we cannot do without in order to have resilient ecosystems? So water is in there, but what's missing? It's the energy cycle, right? And that's what I tried to integrate into this, in this particular paper. It was actually in the other one, but to a much smaller degree, and this paper is focused entirely on that phenomenon, on the energy cycle, and trying to address both local cooling impacts of forest cover and global cooling impacts of forest cover. And the one thing I leave out here is really the albedo effect. And I do this for a reason, because I think we're focused on the wrong thing, right? But if you think I should have included albedo, there's this paper that came out a month later after mine and looked at both clouds and albedo and came basically to the same finding that mine paper came to. So I'd like to introduce the findings first from this paper. And the principal finding is that rainfall and evapotranspiration contribute to cloud cover. So if we have more tree and forest cover, we can increase the total forest cover, and then we can increase the potential cloud cover, because evapotranspiration leads to clouds eventually. So if we were to restore all of the historically lost forest cover, what impact might we have? And I find it, if we restore all of this historically lost forest cover, the impact on the Earth's energy imbalance is huge, depending on whether it's minus 40 or minus 50% that we're using as the baseline. The current Earth's energy imbalance is 0.79 watts per meter squared. This adds 2.2 or 3 watts per meter squared to the land surface, just by producing more clouds, right? So it's a big impact. And of course, the other impact, these are back of the envelope calculations, not run through a global climate model for all kinds of good reasons. And it's important to understand that what we don't know adequately is the magnitude of these effects, right? So it could be 1 to 0.8 or 0.8 to 1. These are things that are difficult to calculate. But I would also like to add in, the other impact is carbon sequestration from trees. The trees draw down carbon from the atmosphere. That also has a cooling effect. And that cooling effect alone is also incredibly important. And of course, these two phenomena are additive. It's not a trade-off between one and the other. We get both of them if we add more tree and forest cover. So they have a huge potential impact on the Earth's energy imbalance, on the warming or the cooling of the land surface. So I can go through this quickly, maybe. This is the carbon dimension, and we know that there's a certain amount drawn down and a certain amount that is emitted back into the atmosphere, also regular emissions. And unfortunately, right now, the amount that we emit back is much larger than what we draw down with trees from the environment. And this drawdown gap is increasing over time. It's getting worse. But what's really interesting is that if we were to just stop deforestation today, we could already reverse this phenomenon, right? If we were to reforest all of the historically lost forest cover, we could reverse this phenomenon just with that. We couldn't necessarily return all the way back, but we could reverse this gap, right? That's enough to reverse the gap. The other thing is evapotranspiration from the land surface. Now, what we notice over the land surface is that the land surface is much, much cooler in areas where we have forest cover that has a lot of water. So well-watered forest cover temperatures are much, much lower than over land anywhere. In cities, in croplands, and the temperature differences can be as much as 15 to 20 degrees Celsius between those two types of land use practice. The differences are huge. And so this total forest cover and with water present is extremely important to the cooling power on the land surface of forests. And essentially, transpiration and evaporation require energy. They take it up into the lower atmosphere, and they reduce, because of that, surface warming. Less surface warming occurs if that energy is taken up into the lower atmosphere. And the same happens in cities as well. I won't emphasize that, but it's, the phenomenon is the same. And I think one of the problems here is that we don't really understand albedo very well, because there's a lot of literature out there that says that forest albedo warms the planet, right? And what we see here is actually forest albedo. Well, forests are darker, but they're cooling, so how can that be, right? Forest albedo cools the planet. Well, if we have a concrete block, black in color, of a certain weight, and we have a certain amount of energy input, the energy input can warm this concrete block by 10 degrees Celsius. If we have a white block, it still warms the energy, the same amount of energy will still warm that block by half the amount, right? Or sorry, half the quantity of concrete, but it will still warm it, even though it's white. So we're always taught in the albedo world that high reflectivity means we don't have warming. It's not necessarily true, right? Even in a white block. And of course, what's really fascinating is if you take a 1 millimeter thick layer of water and project the same amount of energy onto it, the net effect in temperature is 0. It doesn't warm the surface at all. So water is incredibly important to the potential cooling power of the land surface. What do trees do? My goodness. They take water, and tree and forest cover facilitate energy exchange into the atmosphere for two principal reasons. They facilitate evapotranspiration, moving water from the land surface into the atmosphere. And of course, they also contribute, because of this, to cloud formation over land surfaces. And what's even more important, I'll come back to this towards the end of the talk, is that tree and forest cover stores water on the land surface through infiltration and groundwater recharge, so that we have water available at other times when it's needed. It doesn't just take all of the water and evapotranspire it. It puts some of it into the ground and saves it for some other time. Now, before I come back to that, I need to talk about clouds. So the big question is, does this evapotranspiration phenomenon contribute importantly also to global cooling, not just the cooling of the land surface, but also to global cooling? And the catch is that evapotranspiration does lead to cloud formation over land surfaces. And because of this, it increases top of cloud reflectivity, which you see here from this cloud surface. From incoming radiation coming in, reflects it straight back out into space, right? It's incredibly important. Cloud cover matters. Now watch what happens when we take those clouds away. This reflectivity, 100 here, 53 here, is very small, right? And the consequence of this phenomenon, this may be sort of the closest I can come to what a deforested world might look like, right? No real evapotranspiration. The net result of this phenomenon is plus 20 watts per meter squared over the land surface. Remember, Earth's energy imbalance is 0.79 watts per meter squared. So this is a huge impact on the warming of the land surface. So if we lose cloud cover, we get warming. And we get not only small amounts of warming, we get huge amounts of warming, right, if we lose all of that cloud cover. I should say, oceans, of course, evaporate water also, but if we only have 40,000 cubic kilometers of water being transported around the world, that's a lot less, right? So this suggests that deforestation brings significant warming and cooling, and the loss of cloud cover matters a lot, right? So that's where that cooling power of forests come from. So the global cooling comes from the clouds, local cooling comes from the evapotranspiration phenomenon that's driven by tree and forest cover. So what is the impact and the importance of a focus on these key variables? Coming back to our original diagram. So my focus has primarily been down here and maybe up on this ecosystem resilience, but I would argue that essentially this is the foundation we need to ensure all the other features, right? To ensure biodiversity protection, to ensure ecosystem provisioning, and also to be able to ensure ecosystem resilience. Because if we don't have these key state variables guaranteed for human life, none of these other things will work, right? So it's the foundation. How am I doing on time? So I want to come back to this albedo question, because if you look at the albedo literature, they recommend all kinds of wild things. So here they say basically because of ET, snow-covered surfaces and so on, in the outer latitudes, this brings more cooling because there's a lot more reflection of light back out into space. This paper argues essentially that we shouldn't be planting more forest cover in the boreal region because it will lead to more warming, right? And one catch is that the boreal is an energy limited and not a water limited environment. It has lots of water. So if it's energy limited, how does it lead to warming, right? And then the next point is that winter days are short or almost non-existent in large parts of the boreal region, right? So where's the sunlight? And they say that all these studies will say in the summertime it does cool, but in the wintertime, not. This one, also an albedo study, is very similar, except that it focuses on a very different part of the world, on the more semi-arid zones, and says that actually we find the albedo effect is much higher there, and so we should not be reforesting the semi-arid zones of the world, because that will lead to warming, and it's a bad idea. Completely contradictory studies. They do not say the same thing at all. But what's really key is none of these studies consider clouds. In fact, this Hassler et al. Paper, it says explicitly in the paper, they're too difficult to model, so we didn't model them. If it's the biggest potential cooling force out there in the sky, we should be modeling it, right? We can't just ignore it, and we certainly cannot build restoration strategies and goals only on the surface albedo phenomenon. It would be crazy, right? So should we even base restoration strategies on surface albedo measurements at all? I tend to ignore them, because think about this. Surface albedo, especially in plants, is what enables the cooling power and the creation of clouds, right? It's actually sort of an evolutionary principle, right? Plants are darker so that they can attract sunlight, so they can evapotranspire and grow, and that's what gives us increased evapotranspiration and increased cloud cover. So what are the consequences of missing this? And I want to come to one more last graph, and then I'm basically done. So I write also in this paper, this 2024 paper, about evaporation dependence on vegetation. So if we do not have vegetation cover, we do not have evaporation for the most part. It's very limited. And there used to be the paradigm that if we removed all tree and forest cover from the land surface, right, we would have more infiltration and groundwater recharge, and thus more water available overall. So the best idea was to remove vegetation, not increase the cover. The more vegetation cover you have, the more evapotranspiration you have, less infiltration, groundwater recharge. Bad idea overall. Get rid of the vegetation, then we'll have plenty of water, right? And what we're finding is actually, well, no, this isn't true. That we need tree, forest, and vegetation cover in order to get groundwater recharge. I'm going to click right now and watch these arrows, because they will all change. In the updated paradigm, it means that most of the water without vegetation cover will turn into overland flows and go straight into rivers and oceans and not evaporate or evapotranspire. And we'll get almost no infiltration and groundwater recharge. And of course, not much evaporation either from that land surface, because most of it goes as an overland flow into rivers and oceans. So then you have to ask yourself the question, what is sort of a minimum amount of tree restoration that would be necessary to maximize infiltration and groundwater recharge? And we find that somewhere at this medium amount of tree and forest cover, so increasing tree and forest cover goes this way. So this medium amount will maximize enhanced soil water storage and give us the highest amount of groundwater potential. Anything after that starts to contribute more to evapotranspiration, right? So it will then reduce, again, a little bit the total amount of infiltration and groundwater recharge. But you still have to ask, what is the optimal tree density? Not the minimum restoration requirement, but what is the optimal tree cover density? And this is much more complicated, because we want evapotranspiration, because it cools the land surface, because it contributes to cloud formation. But it takes away from water in the catchment, right? Because not all the evapotranspiration returns to the same catchment as rainfall. And so we have to find some kind of medium in here that makes everybody happy at the catchment scale, so that to be sure we have enough water available at the catchment scale. But in any case, the optimal tree cover density is higher than this minimum tree cover requirement, right? Now, one last problem, climate change. I haven't talked really about climate change per se yet. Talk about cooling power, but not about climate change. So what is the impact of climate change in all of this? And you've heard this discussion, right? That the landscape is drying out. and we're having problems because of drought and wildfires and trees dying and so on. And all of this is very true, right? And so then the question is, what is the impact of climate change? Now when I click, this is gonna change, look a little funny. My sound didn't play. I'm disappointed. Anyway, basically my view is that it shifts this diagram down. So this appears at a lower point. This maximum is now in a bit. And so it changes the basic dimensions that we can work within if we maintain the same tree and forest cover as we did previously. Think about this carefully, right? Climate change means essentially that the tree and forest cover that was previously, that is here now, is no longer adapted to these conditions because we've had climate warming, right? And so maybe we need new tree and forest cover. And of course, one alternative is that if we change the forest cover for these locations, then we might be able to go back up to this larger picture because those trees might be adapted, might evapotranspire less, and so on. But this is the basic sort of picture of the impact of climate change. Now, I forgot to make one last point, I'll make it now. This minimum restoration requirement matters tremendously when you think about this Hassler and al. Paper that's talking about albedo cover, because their suggestion is in the semi-arid zones, we should not be planting any more tree and forest cover vegetation. But in this model, if we don't plant tree and forest cover vegetation, we have no infiltration, we have no groundwater recharge, we have reduced amounts of water available, and the tree and vegetation cover that could produce evapotranspiration and cloud formation will disappear. Bad idea, in my view, the Hassler and all one. Very bad idea. My ETH colleagues. So a focus only on carbon and diversity, biodiversity is not enough. We need to focus on these key foundational state variables, and the principal ones being the water cycle and the energy cycle and how these interact with vegetation. Increased wetland, tree, forest, and vegetation cover contribute dramatically to many significant and beneficial outcomes. So the cross-continental transport and recycling of water and atmospheric moisture, this is this precipitation recycling phenomenon. The cooling of terrestrial surfaces, lowering of surface temperatures requires tree, forest, and vegetation cover. Reduction of atmospheric CO2 through carbon sequestration. Increasing cloud cover and top of atmosphere reflectivity. This is the principal phenomenon that contributes to global cooling power, the global cooling power of forests. And then I like to argue each tree is a carbon sink, each tree is a cooling tower, each tree is a potential source of future rainfall. So, and that's it.
Thank you very much, David. So it's a plant awareness.
Just for online participants, we can also include you into the discussion. So please, if you have any question, write it into the chat and we will answer here. Sorry.
So we had a lecture from the broad scale. Please, Martin Lindner. I'm coming, Martin. Moment.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting and impressive. I mean, everyone is sad about the deforestation, but do you also see reforestation activities or maybe natural processes where we get plant cover again, like maybe the green wall, which we have in Northern Africa in the Sahara zone, or are there more activities? Which brings hope to us.
So certainly in the northern hemisphere, I think, the forests have been growing, not declining, right? Although it's not as though deforestation has disappeared, but at least reforestation occurs at a higher rate than deforestation in the northern hemisphere for the most part. In the southern hemisphere, the opposite seems to be true for the most part. I work on 4 West African countries, and we tried to put together an estimate of tree cover gain or loss, and overall the maximum, the net outcome is tree cover loss. And that's kind of discouraging because trees and forest cover are supposed to be the principal tools of their climate change mitigation frameworks in the UNFCCC. So that's actually very discouraging. But there are examples of increased forest cover. I've been lobbying for this idea through the EU's LULUCF policy framework since 2011, trying to say we need more tree and forest cover. We need to have a mechanism that incentivizes more tree and forest cover. And maybe now we're getting there with things like carbon farming strategies and emphasis on payments for ecosystem services in the European Union and things like that. I think there's a lot that could be improved. I could have a whole talk on that subject, but yeah, there is some element of positive change, but there are also elements of negative change, I would say.
Thank you for bringing this theme of infiltration that is not enough emphasized, I think, in current science. It is something that I've discovered is very rarely measured. In fact, for example, the Department of Engineering, Environmental Engineering I come from, we discovered with a third-year student that no laboratory in our department measures practically infiltration. It's always, they all model climate change, they model hydrology. We are one of the departments that is cited among the 100 best institutions in water resources management, and there is no laboratory measures infiltration. And at the same time, we have alien species in Africa, for example, that are covering millions of hectares, changing infiltration properties of soils, just simply by spreading their distributions. And this is beyond direct anthropogenic effects. So I think this needs to be much more closely looked at. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you for the comment. I would basically just agree absolutely. I have some colleagues in Sweden, for example, who are looking at the decline in forest growth, which is partly driven by this water phenomenon, this drying phenomenon. And I asked them if in their study they plan to measure infiltration, groundwater recharge, the water table, and so on. And he said, "Oh, that's a great idea. We should do that." So it wasn't part of the plan.
It was Nick Pacini. Right? You can address him. He speaks Czech. Yeah. And he now is in Calabria University in South Italy. Next questions? If not, I think we are in time. David, many thanks. I think it will be used, this one. And it's fantastic that you did it for people who teach. So it's really understandable because it was not scientific audience, but pedagogical audience. Thank you very much.